From the beginning of his life, Joseph of Cupertino proved to be a singular child, although at first sight many considered him odd or even clumsy. Born on June 17, 1603, in the small village of Cupertino, in the Kingdom of Naples, present-day Italy, he was the son of a humble couple, Felice Desa and Franceschina Panara. His father died even before his birth, leaving the family in a state of great poverty. Joseph's childhood was marked by material privations and hardships, but also by an uncommon spiritual sensitivity which already showed itself in his withdrawn and quiet manner. From a young age, he seemed to live more turned toward the things of heaven than those of earth, spending long moments in contemplation and prayer, even when he should have been playing with other children his age. Despite his piety, Joseph faced enormous difficulties in his studies and in practical life. He was considered slow to learn and constantly distracted, which earned him mockery and reprimands. His mother, a woman of strong temperament, despaired over the apparent incapacity of her son, believing that he would never be able to support himself. Nevertheless, in the heart of that frail boy, there burned an intense love for God and for Our Lady, a love that led him to endure humiliations and punishments without revolt. Already at this stage of life, Joseph began to have his first ecstasies and mystical transports. During prayers, he seemed oblivious to the world, remaining motionless, his eyes turned upward, his face transfigured by a gentle light. Such phenomena aroused curiosity and even scandal among those who observed him, for no one understood what was happening to him. Joseph's adolescence was even more troubled. Desiring to consecrate himself to God, he tried to enter various convents, but he was constantly rejected for his lack of intellectual abilities and for his awkward appearance. He worked for a time as a helper in a stable of the Capuchin friars, but because of his inattention and slowness, he was seen as useless and was eventually dismissed. This failure plunged him into deep sadness, but it also impelled him to intensify his life of prayer and penance. He spent hours fasting, imploring the Virgin Mary to intercede for him. His desire to serve God was sincere and ardent, even if his human frailty seemed an insurmountable obstacle. It was only after many frustrated attempts that Joseph managed to be accepted as a servant in the convent of the conventual Franciscans. His function was as humble as possible, to care for the mules and carry out simple manual tasks. However, it was in this hidden and silent service that he began to blossom spiritually. Despite continuing to have great intellectual difficulties, he showed exemplary obedience, patience, and extraordinary humility. His superiors, moved by his virtue, began to see in him not a fool, but a true man of God. Little by little, they allowed him to attend some classes, and with great effort and prayer, Joseph began to assimilate small portions of theology and liturgy. Even with his heart inflamed with love for God, Joseph continued to be the target of mockery and scorn from some confreres, who called him Brother Donkey. He, however, received all the humiliations with a smile and offered them to the Lord as penance. This attitude deeply moved the more experienced friars, who perceived in him a rare and heroic virtue, the capacity to endure contempt with serenity and charity. While many young religious sought recognition and positions, Joseph desired only to hide himself and to love God in silence and simplicity. This radical humility prepared his heart for the extraordinary graces that heaven would later grant him. When the time finally came to take the examinations for the priesthood, Joseph feared he would not succeed. He was known for his extreme difficulty in memorizing texts and answering questions. However, something surprising happened. At the moment of the exam, the examiner asked him exactly about the one passage of the Gospel that he had memorized. This coincidence was interpreted by the friars as a clear sign of divine providence. Joseph passed the exam and, against all human expectations, was ordained a priest in 1628. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase of his life, in which the mystical gifts would become even more evident and impressive. After his ordination, Joseph began to celebrate the Holy Mass with such intense devotion that he frequently fell into ecstasy during the consecration. His eyes would lift to heaven, his body would tremble, and at times rise from the ground in an inexplicable way, levitating before the astonished assembly. These levitation phenomena would occur countless times over the course of his life, becoming his best-known characteristic and a motive for both admiration and persecution. Despite the fame these manifestations brought him, Joseph remained profoundly humble, attributing everything to the mercy of God and desiring only to remain hidden and obedient. Joseph of Cupertino's reputation for holiness spread rapidly, attracting crowds who wanted to see him or receive his blessing. People from all social classes, including nobles and prelates, came to him to ask for counsel and prayers. This caused great disruption in the convent's routine and also aroused the envy of some brothers who accused him of simulating ecstasies. To avoid scandal, the superiors decided to transfer him several times, keeping him in remote convents under strict surveillance. Even so, the extraordinary phenomena continued, and wherever he was, the people ended up discovering and flocking to see him. Joseph's levitations did not occur only during Mass, but also before sacred images or upon hearing the name of Jesus and Mary. A religious melody was enough, or the simple mention of God, for him to detach from the world and be wrapped in contemplation. During these ecstasies, he became insensible to the surrounding environment, not responding to stimuli and remaining motionless or suspended in the air, something that physicians and theologians of the time could not explain. Eyewitnesses, including scientists, recorded these episodes, leaving detailed accounts that were later used in his canonization process. Although the mystical gifts were extraordinary, Joseph neither sought nor valued them for their own sake. His only desire was to love God with all his heart and to fulfill his will. When he perceived that the ecstasies caused confusion or distraction among the faithful, he asked his superiors to be removed from public celebrations. He obediently accepted being isolated in simple cells, far from contact with the crowds. For him, the greatest miracle was to remain in the presence of God in silence, even if no one understood him. His interior life was marked by continual prayer, rigorous fasts, and severe penances, which he offered for the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of the Church. As the years passed, Joseph was transferred to various convents, always by order of his superiors and with total docility on his part. He lived in extreme poverty, sleeping on boards, eating the minimum necessary, and dedicating himself to almost constant prayer. Despite being frail in health and limited in intelligence, he had become a giant of faith and a true mystic, whose life was a living testimony to the power of divine grace manifesting itself in human weakness. His fame, however, continued to grow, and ecclesiastical authorities eventually had to intervene to contain the popular fervor that surrounded him. After his priestly ordination, the mystical phenomena of Saint Joseph of Cupertino became increasingly frequent and visible. During the celebration of the Holy Mass, it was enough to pronounce the name of Jesus or to contemplate the consecrated host for him to enter into deep ecstasy. Witnesses reported that his eyes filled with tears, his face was transfigured, and many times his body was raised from the ground in a supernatural way. These levitations took place before crowds and left the faithful in wonder, leading many to be converted or to renew their faith. However, these same phenomena aroused the suspicion of some clerics who, unable to understand such a manifestation, feared they were illusions of the devil. Joseph, for his part, suffered from this unwanted attention and incessantly asked God to hide his gifts so that he might live in humility and silence. The fame of the friar who flew quickly spread throughout Italy and to other European countries. Ecclesiastical and even civil authorities began to investigate the events surrounding his life. On some occasions, physicians and scientists were called to examine his ecstasies, attempting to find natural explanations for the phenomena. Finding nothing to justify them, many ended up recognizing that it was something supernatural. Nonetheless, this fame brought great suffering to Joseph. The constant flow of pilgrims seeking miracles disturbed the routine of the convents and created jealousy among his confreres, who accused him of pretense and theatricality. His superiors, fearing scandal and wishing to protect his soul, decided to isolate him in distant monasteries, far from the public. In 1638, an anonymous denunciation reached the Roman Inquisition, accusing Joseph of being an impostor and of simulating ecstasies to deceive the people. The Holy Office ordered that he be taken to Naples to be interrogated. This was one of the most painful moments of his life, for despite being innocent, Joseph was treated with suspicion and coldness, being forced to explain in detail each phenomenon that surrounded him. During the interrogations, he remained serene, humble, and obedient, answering only what was necessary and making it clear that everything that happened came solely from God. At the end of the process, they found no fault in his conduct and absolved him of all accusations, recognizing his innocence. Even so, they decided that he should remain away from contact with the faithful. By order of the Holy See, Joseph was transferred to the convent of Assisi, where he lived in a near-cloistered regime for several years. His superiors imposed on him a life of strict recollection, forbidding him to celebrate Mass in public or to receive visitors. This isolation, which for many would be a punishment, he accepted with joy and gratitude, for at last he could live hidden and entirely given over to prayer. He spent his days in silence, fasting, meditating on the Passion of Christ and reciting the Rosary. His cell was extremely simple, with only a board as a bed and a crucifix on the wall. Even in this recollection, the mystical phenomena did not cease. Brothers of the convent reported seeing him levitate alone in the chapel at night, wrapped in contemplation. This hidden life did not last long, because even in Assisi, the people ended up discovering his presence and began to surround the convent, clamoring for blessings and miracles. To contain the popular commotion, the Holy See ordered that he be transferred again, this time to the convent of Pietrarubia, and then to Fossombrone, both in remote places. In these transfers, Joseph demonstrated perfect obedience, departing without protest and taking with him only a crucifix and a rosary. His blind obedience was a powerful testimony to his confreres, who saw in him the fulfillment of the words of the gospel. Whoever wishes to be the greatest, let him be the servant of all. Even in the face of incomprehension and suspicions, he never defended himself or complained, but offered everything as penance for the salvation of souls. During this period of isolation, his life became even more austere and penitential. He fed himself only on bread and water, slept few hours, and spent long vigils in prayer. He used to scourge himself with a cord discipline and wore cilices hidden under his clothes as a form of mortification. His confreres reported that he remained for hours in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, motionless like a statue, with his gaze fixed on the host and tears running down his face. When he was not in prayer, he performed small manual services in the convent, always with a spirit of humility and joy. Joseph's presence, although silent, radiated a heavenly peace that transformed the environment wherever he passed. Even in isolation, Joseph did not cease to exercise a powerful apostolate through his prayers. Various people who asked for his intercession from afar obtained cures, spiritual consolations, and sudden conversions. Many letters arrived at the convents where he lived, reporting graces obtained through his prayers. He, however, refused any credit for these prodigies, insisting that he was not worthy to be called a saint and that he only repeated, as a poor servant, "Fiat voluntas Dei, may the will of God be done." This attitude of total detachment from spiritual gifts impressed even his superiors, who saw in him a rare example of heroic humility, capable of not becoming vainglorious even when surrounded by extraordinary signs. Despite all the gifts, Joseph considered himself the last of men and said he was unworthy even of the priesthood. When some confrère praised him, he would prostrate himself on the ground, kiss the brothers' feet, and beg them to pray for his sinful soul. He had a filial and ardent devotion to the Virgin Mary, whom he called his heavenly mommy, and he entrusted everything to her protection. It was common to see him recite the rosary on his knees for hours, even when he was sick or exhausted. He also had great love for St. Francis of Assisi, whose spirit of poverty and humility he sought to imitate in everything. His Franciscan spirituality was marked by a simple and contagious joy, even in the midst of the hardest sufferings. In 1653, by decision of Pope Innocent X, Joseph was transferred to the convent of Osimo, where he would remain until his death. The order was that he should live in complete seclusion, without contact with the public and without any exterior manifestation of his gifts. For many, this would seem a cruel punishment, but for him it was an immense grace. At last he could live hidden with God, far from curious eyes and crowds. In Osimo, his life became entirely contemplative, marked by absolute silence, frequent fasts, and an almost continuous routine of prayer. His superiors reported that he seemed to live in a state of constant union with God, even in the simplest and most banal tasks. In the last years of his life, his health became frail and his body debilitated, but his spirit remained ardent. He spent long nights in prayer, even when feverish and weakened. The friars who lived with him testified that, even debilitated, he continued to be wrapped in ecstasies before the Blessed Sacrament, as if his soul no longer fit within his mortal body. Knowing that his death was approaching, Joseph prepared himself with great serenity, confessing frequently, receiving the Eucharist with tears, and repeating continually, "Mary, my mother, come to fetch me." On the night of September 18th, 1663, after receiving the last sacraments, he serenely gave his soul to God at 60 years of age, surrounded by a light of holiness that impressed all who were present. Soon after the death of Saint Joseph of Cupertino, reports of miracles attributed to his intercession began to multiply. The friars who had lived with him testified that his body exuded a gentle fragrance and that his countenance remained serene and luminous, as if he were only sleeping. People who touched his personal objects or prayed at his tomb began to report inexplicable physical cures and extraordinary spiritual graces. Many sick were suddenly restored, hardened sinners were converted, and entire families testified to profound changes in their lives after invoking his name with faith. These facts began to attract pilgrims to Osimo, transforming the place into a center of popular devotion already in the first years after his passing. The conventual friars, impressed by the quantity and consistency of the testimonies, decided to collect and carefully document each miracle reported. Written records were compiled and signed by physicians, religious, and lay people, describing with precision the events and their circumstances. These proofs were sent to the Holy See as part of the process for the opening of his cause of beatification. Besides the physical miracles, there were also numerous reports of interior graces, people who, upon praying before his tomb, experienced a burning desire for conversion, a renewed love for the Eucharist, and a filial confidence in Our Lady, characteristic marks of Joseph's spirituality. This witness of living holiness became increasingly incontestable in the eyes of the Church. The cause of beatification was officially opened in 1753, 90 years after his death, during the pontificate of Pope Benedict XIV. The process was meticulous, gathering hundreds of pages of sworn testimonies, including accounts of his heroic virtues, his mystical gifts, and the innumerable prodigies that occurred both in life and posthumously. Theologians and physicians analyzed the documents with extreme rigor, seeking to exclude any possibility of fraud, popular exaggeration, or natural explanations. The result of these investigations confirmed the authenticity of his virtuous life and the supernatural character of the miracles. Thus, Joseph of Cupertino was solemnly beatified by Pope Clement V on February 24, 1753, in a ceremony that brought together a multitude of faithful and religious from all over Italy. After the beatification, devotion to Joseph of Cupertino expanded through various European countries and also reached the Americas. Churches, chapels, and altars began to be dedicated to him, and his image came to be represented in a Franciscan habit, with a serene countenance and frequently in levitation before the host or an image of Our Lady. Catholic schools and religious communities began to invoke him as an example of humility and obedience, and the faithful turned to him especially in times of trials and intellectual difficulties. Many students and seminarians began to invoke him before tests and examinations, remembering that Joseph himself, even with his limitations, had been miraculously helped by God in his studies and assessments for the priesthood. The reputation for holiness of Blessed Joseph of Cupertino continued to grow and consolidate over the years. Reports of new graces obtained through his intercession constantly reached the Holy See, coming from different parts of the world. In view of this, the process for his canonization was initiated, which required the proof of at least 2 miracles that occurred after the beatification. These miracles were investigated with extreme rigor by medical and theological commissions, which attested to the absence of scientific explanation and recognized the supernatural intervention. After the confirmation of these prodigies and the renewed analysis of his heroic virtues, Pope Clement III declared Joseph of Cupertino a saint of the Catholic Church on July 16, 1767, raising him to the honors of the altars before a jubilant multitude in Rome. The canonization of Saint Joseph of Cupertino was received with great joy by the Christian people, who saw in it the official recognition of a saint whose life seemed a paradox in the eyes of the world, a simple man, limited intellectually and despised by many, yet chosen by God to be a living sign of his presence. The Church presented him as a model of humility and of absolute trust in divine grace, showing that true wisdom does not lie in a brilliant intellect, but in the heart that sincerely loves God. His story came to be told in devotional books, catecheses, and homilies, inspiring generations of faithful to embrace the path of evangelical littleness. As the centuries passed, Saint Joseph of Cupertino became the official patron of students, of exam candidates, and of all those who face intellectual or educational difficulties. His devotion spread especially among the young, who see in him a friend and understanding intercessor. On the eve of exams, millions of students around the world pray to Saint Joseph of Cupertino, asking his help to remember what they have studied and to remain calm, trusting that God can act even in the midst of human weakness. This simple and popular devotion keeps the memory of the saint alive and conveys the central message of his life, that nothing is impossible for God when we abandon ourselves trustingly into his hands. Besides his protection of students, Saint Joseph of Cupertino is also invoked as an intercessor in cases of depression, anxiety, and spiritual disturbances, for he himself faced incomprehension, humiliations, and isolation throughout his life. Many faithful testify that they find consolation and hope when turning to him in moments of discouragement and interior darkness. This consoling dimension of his spirituality shows that his mission did not end with death, but continues alive in the Church as a sign that God delights in exalting the humble and sustaining the weak. His spiritual presence continues to bring peace to afflicted hearts and to rekindle the flame of faith in those who feel forgotten or incapable. Currently, the mortal remains of Saint Joseph of Cupertino rest in Osimo, in Italy, in a sanctuary that receives thousands of pilgrims every year. The place has become a center of Franciscan spirituality and popular devotion, where faithful from all over the world go to give thanks for graces obtained or to ask for his intercession. Many leave letters, notes, and personal objects as a sign of gratitude, and the atmosphere of the sanctuary is marked by profound silence and recollection, reflecting the life of the saint himself. His body, preserved with veneration, remains as a visible testimony of the holiness that springs from humility, reminding pilgrims that the glory of heaven is promised to the little ones and to those who trust totally in the love of God. The legacy of Saint Joseph of Cupertino for the Church remains current and necessary. In a world that values success, prestige, and intelligence, his life proclaims that the path of holiness passes through humility, obedience, and absolute trust in God. He shows that human limitations are not obstacles to grace, but on the contrary, can be the place where God manifests his power. His story continues to inspire religious, students, and lay people to embrace the simplicity of the gospel and to seek not the applause of the world, but the loving gaze of the Father. Saint Joseph of Cupertino remains a beacon for those who feel weak, reminding us that in God's eyes, the little ones are the truly great. The life of Saint Joseph of Cupertino is, above all, a powerful testimony that holiness does not depend on great human talents, but on total surrender to God. He was born frail, poor, and without any distinction, being considered incapable for studies and useless for manual work. However, instead of becoming discouraged before his limitations, he made of them the fertile ground where divine grace could blossom in splendor. His story shows that God does not choose the qualified, but qualifies those he chooses, and that the path of holiness is open to all, even to the smallest in the eyes of the world. This teaching is profoundly current for today's Christians, who often feel crushed by the demands of a society that idolizes success and despises weakness. Another central lesson of his life is the value of evangelical humility. Joseph never sought recognition, positions, or prestige within the Franciscan order, and he endured with serenity the mockeries and humiliations he received throughout his life. When he was called Brother Donkey by his companions, he accepted the insults with a smile and responded with charity. This attitude, far from being weakness, revealed an extraordinary spiritual strength, the interior freedom of one who does not need human approval because he knows himself loved by God. At a time when vanity and self-promotion seem to dominate even religious environments, Saint Joseph of Cupertino reminds Christians that true greatness lies in becoming small like a child before the Father. Saint Joseph of Cupertino also teaches us the value of obedience. Even when he was misunderstood or treated with suspicion, he never rebelled against his superiors. He accepted being transferred repeatedly, living in isolation, being deprived of the public celebration of Mass, and even being investigated by the Inquisition, all with a spirit of docility and abandonment to the divine will. His obedience was not servile, but deeply rooted in love for Christ, who was obedient unto death on a cross. This faithful and joyful obedience is an invitation to today's Christians to rediscover the beauty of submission to God's will, especially when it is manifested through the legitimate authority of the Church and the commitments of our state of life. The spirituality of Saint Joseph of Cupertino is also profoundly Eucharistic. It was before the Eucharist that he entered into ecstasy, carried away by a love that overflowed even in his body. His example invites the faithful to rediscover the mystery of the real presence of Christ in the Blessed Sacrament, not as a distant symbol, but as the living heart of the Church. At a time when so many Catholics lose the sense of the sacred and of adoration, Joseph of Cupertino shows that the true center of Christian life is the presence of Jesus in the consecrated host. He reminds us that the Mass is not a formal rite, but a personal and transformative encounter with the living God who gives himself to us out of love. Another striking feature of his life was his ardent love for the Virgin Mary. Since childhood, Joseph called Our Lady his heavenly mommy and entrusted to her all his difficulties and hopes. He prayed the rosary daily, even when sick or exhausted, and attributed to her all the graces he received. This filial love for Mary is an essential element of Christian spirituality and shows us that the surest path to Jesus passes through Mary's maternal heart. In times of spiritual coldness and relativism, Saint Joseph of Cupertino invites Christians to renew their consecration to the Mother of God, seeking in her the tenderness, protection, and firmness that only a mother can offer her children. The life of Saint Joseph of Cupertino is also a hymn to evangelical joy. Despite humiliations, isolation, and physical pains, he always maintained a serene countenance and a simple joy that was contagious to everyone around him. This joy did not come from the absence of problems, but from the constant presence of God in his soul. Today, when so many Christians live anguished and discouraged, Joseph's example shows that true joy does not depend on circumstances, but springs from a heart that loves and trusts in God. His life is an invitation to rediscover joy as a fruit of the Holy Spirit, a visible sign that Christ is alive in us. Saint Joseph of Cupertino is also a great model of persevering prayer. He spent hours in silent contemplation, even when he felt nothing or understood little with his limited mind. His prayer was simple, made with few words, but full of love and trust. He shows that prayer is not a matter of eloquence or knowledge, but of presence and surrender of the heart. For Christians who feel dry, distracted, or incapable of praying, Joseph's life is a consolation and an encouragement. Even if our mind is weak, God rejoices in the sincere and persevering love of our humble prayer. Another precious teaching of his life is the acceptance of one's own limitations. While many despair for not being brilliant, charismatic, or talented, Joseph found holiness precisely in embracing his weakness and offering it to God. He did not try to be what he was not, but let God be everything in his littleness. This attitude is profoundly liberating and shows that holiness does not consist in doing grand things, but in doing the small things of each day with love, trusting that God transforms them into something infinite. For Christians who struggle with feelings of inferiority or failure, Saint Joseph of Cupertino is a spiritual friend who reminds us the grace of God is enough. And finally, the life of Saint Joseph of Cupertino is a call to hope. He shows that there are no lost situations when we trust in God. He who seemed condemned to failure became a priest, a mystic, and a canonized saint. His story proves that God can transform the greatest weaknesses into instruments of salvation, and that no one is too small to be a saint. This message is especially important in our times, when so many lose hope in the face of difficulties. Saint Joseph of Cupertino invites us to lift our eyes to heaven and to believe that with God, all things are possible, even the impossible. Today, more than ever, Saint Joseph of Cupertino remains current and necessary. His silent testimony of humility, obedience, prayer, and love shows the sure path of holiness in the midst of a noisy and confused world. He reminds us that holiness is not reserved for the strong, but for the little ones who abandon themselves to the love of God. May all Christians, especially those who feel weak, insecure, or incapable, look to this saint and find in him the certainty that divine grace is enough, and that heaven is open to those who, like Joseph of Cupertino, dare to be little so that God may be great in them. The sky was silent on the night of September 18, 1663. In the simple cell of the convent of Osimo, a frail and sickly friar prepared himself for the greatest of all his flights. All his life he had been called a fool, incapable, a dead weight upon the world. But there, in the seclusion of that poor room, Joseph of Cupertino closed his eyes not as a failure, but as a saint who had fulfilled the will of God to the end. There were no crowds, no trumpets, no acclamations, only the whisper of a prayer and the faint smile of one who was already contemplating eternity. Throughout his existence, Joseph had defied the logic of the world. When the world said he was weak, he chose to be small so that God might be great. When they mocked his ignorance, he answered with silence and charity. When they tried to erase him from history, God raised him to the heavens, sometimes literally, before the astonished eyes of men. Each humiliation became compost for his holiness, each tear a seed of glory. He did not conquer with eloquent speeches, nor with human achievements, but with an obstinate faith that clung to heaven even when the ground was taken from beneath him. And so, the friar who so many times floated before the altar was now flying definitively, not through the air but into the arms of the Father. His frail body remained behind, but his humble soul tore through the heavens like a silent star, carrying with it the prayers of the poor, the simple, and the forgotten. In that instant the angels rejoiced and the saints welcomed him as a brother, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to the little ones. The earth lost a despised man, heaven gained a giant of grace. Today, centuries later, his story continues to echo like a prophecy for weary hearts. Saint Joseph of Cupertino is living proof that God chooses the weak to confound the strong, the small to confound the great. He reminds us that holiness is not reserved for geniuses, but for those who love without measure. To every insecure student, to every wounded soul, to every Christian who feels incapable, he whispers from heaven, "Do not fear your weakness. God is sufficient unto it to work wonders." And thus, the humble friar of Cupertino, who did not know how to speak before men, became an eternal voice that proclaims to the four corners of the earth, "The love of God raises those whom the world casts down." His flight did not end. It continues in every heart that dares to believe that even while being small, it can touch the infinite.